Our story begins with the birth of Hans Schmidt in 1881 in the Bavarian town of Askenberg. His parents came from very different religious backgrounds. One was a devout Protestant, and the other, a practicing Catholic. This division was not just theological but also personal, as Hans grew up in an environment dominated by violence and instability. His father, a stern and abusive figure, often subjected him to physical punishment, fostering an atmosphere of fear in their home. As he matured, Hans began to display disturbing behaviors that alarmed those around him. His fascination with blood and violence grew stronger, and he developed an unsettling interest in acts of mutilation. Family members recalled a particularly chilling incident during his childhood when he decapitated 2 geese from their farm and hid their severed heads in his pockets. This was not an isolated incident. Hans would visit the local slaughterhouse daily, watching the brutal butchery unfold, further feeding his morbid fascination with death and mutilation. This behavior raised concerns among his relatives, who feared it might be a sign of deeper, more dangerous impulses. Despite these unsettling tendencies, Hans completed his schooling and pursued theological studies, expressing a desire to become a Catholic priest. However, his ambitions did not align with a life of religious service. Instead, he sought out illicit ways to earn money. At one point, he was caught forging academic diplomas for students who had failed their exams, allowing them to appear as if they had passed. His fraudulent activities were discovered following an extensive investigation, revealing that Hans had been fabricating official documents to cover up the students' failures. This offense was a severe breach of academic ethics and sparked outrage in the local educational community. The authorities were determined to punish Hans for his crimes, and there was considerable pressure to secure a prison sentence in order to deter such fraudulent behavior. Yet, his father, desperate to protect his son, hired a skilled lawyer to defend him. The lawyer's defense strategy centered on the argument that Hans' actions were a result of an underlying psychological condition rather than deliberate criminal intent. He highlighted a family history of mental illness and suggested that the tensions between Hans' parents, one Protestant, the other Catholic, had contributed to a highly unstable and stressful home life. The lawyer's argument found favor with the court, and the charges against Hans were dropped. However, doubts about his mental and moral stability persisted, especially regarding his suitability for a role in the clergy. Despite these concerns, Hans insisted that he had been ordained as a priest by a German bishop, Bishop Kirsten, on December 23, 1904. Whenever questioned about the details of his ordination, Hans maintained that it had been a private ceremony. He even added a strange twist to his story, claiming that the true ordination had taken place the night before in a vision. According to Hans, while praying at his bedside, he had experienced a miraculous encounter with Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, a 13th-century noblewoman renowned for her compassion and charitable works. Hans described how, in a blinding light, Saint Elizabeth appeared before him and placed her hand upon his head, declaring, "I ordain you to the priesthood." After this supernatural experience, Hans continued his priestly duties and was assigned to several remote villages. During his time in these small communities, alarming accusations began to surface. Hans was accused of inappropriate behavior toward young altar boys, which caused considerable concern within the church and the local population. It was also widely known that Hans Schmidt's life continued to be marred by scandal and controversy as he ventured further into his career. He had become entangled in numerous relationships with women who attended his services regularly. The rumors surrounding him also spread to less reputable circles. Whispers of his frequent visits to prostitutes only added to the tarnishing of his already questionable reputation. These moral controversies were compounded by criticism regarding his unorthodox methods and the bizarre nature of his sermons. Many in his parish, as well as fellow clergy, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with his eccentric behavior. It wasn't long before complaints about him reached the bishop, and Hans' reputation continued to deteriorate. As his standing within the church weakened, the parishes in the area began to turn him away. No church seemed willing to accept him, and it became increasingly clear that Hans' opportunities to continue serving as a priest in Germany were running out. With few remaining allies and no hope of redemption, Hans faced the grim reality of a dead-end career. So, in 1909, desperate for a fresh start and hoping to escape the shadows of his past, Hans left Germany for the United States. He saw America as a place where he could leave behind the troubles that had dogged him and begin anew. Upon arriving in the U.S., Hans was assigned to the St. John's Roman Catholic Church in Louisville, Kentucky. However, his time there was short-lived. His slightly unconventional approach to worship, combined with the strange and theatrical nature of his sermons, created an uneasy atmosphere within the congregation. His interpretations of Scripture were often unorthodox, and his tendency to deliver his messages with dramatic flair left many parishioners feeling uncomfortable and bewildered. Furthermore, his behavior clashed with the more traditional views held by the other priests, leading to growing tensions between Hans and his colleagues. As these tensions escalated, it became increasingly evident that Hans' presence in the church was causing division not only among the clergy, but also within the broader community. The local church officials, realizing the situation could not be ignored, decided that a reassignment was the best solution. So, Hans was transferred to St. Boniface Church in New York City. In 1912, while at St. Boniface, Hans met Anna Amula, a young, attractive housekeeper who had immigrated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire 2 years earlier in search of better opportunities. Anna and Hans quickly became close, often spending time together, sharing personal stories and thoughts. Initially, Anna felt secure in Hans' presence, believing that his role as a priest would ensure that their relationship remained professional. However, it soon became clear that Hans was not only attracted to her, but also began to express his romantic interest despite his religious vows. At first, Anna resisted his advances, but over time, she found herself succumbing to his persistence. The two began an illicit affair, though Hans was not exclusive. By the end of 1912, he had also entered into a secret same-sex relationship with a local dentist named Ernst Moret. Despite the conflicting nature of his relationships, Hans did his best to maintain both, continuing to juggle his attachments while trying to balance his commitments to Anna and Ernst. To reassure Anna of his devotion, Hans made bold promises to her, assuring her that he intended to leave the priesthood to be with her. He even went so far as to stage a private marriage ceremony, conducting it himself, and symbolically writing their names on a marriage certificate as a gesture of his commitment. Despite these assurances, however, Hans' behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. One evening, while alone with Anna at the high altar of St. Joseph's Church in Harlem, Hans made a chilling admission. He told her that he believed he had received a divine command to sacrifice her. His tone was intense, and the gravity of his words terrified Anna. She immediately rejected his proposition, telling him that he had lost his mind. Fearful of what he might be capable of, Anna confided in a friend about the bizarre encounter. Shortly after this unsettling conversation, Anna discovered that she was pregnant. When she shared the news with Hans, it only intensified the already fragile and volatile nature of their relationship. Hans, already overwhelmed by his conflicting emotions, now found himself grappling with the idea of fatherhood. The news stirred up a whirlwind of fear and anxiety within him, making his already unstable psychological state even more fragile. On the night of September 2, 1913, Hans conducted Mass, though his increasingly erratic behavior was becoming harder to ignore. His conduct had reached a point where those around him could no longer deny that something was seriously wrong. On the evening of September 2, 1913, Hans Schmidt conducted the usual evening Mass, offering prayers and blessings to his congregation. Afterward, he went about his duties, taking care to prepare the altar and ensure that everything was left in perfect order for the next day's service. However, as the days passed, something unusual occurred. Anna, the young housekeeper at St. Joseph's Church, was nowhere to be seen. Her sudden disappearance raised some concerns, first quietly among the clergy, and soon among the rest of the church staff. By September 6th, her absence had grown more alarming. Children playing near Clayton's bathhouse along the banks of the Hudson River made an unsettling discovery. The headless and legless torso of a woman was found wrapped in blood-stained sheets and a pillowcase, partially buried in the sand. The children quickly raised the alarm, and soon the police arrived at the scene. Investigators searched the shoreline for any additional clues that might help identify the body. They speculated that the body had likely been in the process of being buried when the children's presence frightened the perpetrator, who fled the scene. The body was transported to the Hoboken morgue, where an autopsy was performed. The doctors determined that the woman had been in good health prior to her death, and they observed that she likely came from an affluent background. Her smooth skin and well-manicured hands indicated that she had lived a life of comfort, free from the burdens of manual labor. However, despite these observations, the victim's identity remained unknown. Just 2 days later, on September 8th, a second piece of the victim's dismembered body was discovered. This time, the remains were found in the North River near a ferry dock. The lower part of the torso was soon confirmed to be a match for the upper portion discovered on September 6th. The torso was wrapped in a white cotton pillowcase, intricately embroidered with the letter A and a floral design. The pillowcase had been packed into heavy brown paper, weighed down with a rock, a type of stone typically found in Manhattan and the Bronx but rare in New Jersey. Along with the remains, investigators found a piece of a New York newspaper dated August 11th, as well as fine thread and wrapped wire, which was often used by milliners when making hats. From the examination, doctors concluded that the victim was approximately 26 years old, of medium height and build. As the investigation deepened, a curious detail emerged. The price tag was still attached to the pillowcase. This clue turned out to be crucial in the case. Officers traced the tag to a textile factory located in Newark, which produced high-quality linens. The factory, however, only sold its products to one retailer, George Sachs, a prominent furniture dealer in Manhattan. This discovery narrowed the focus of the investigation, linking the body parts to a particular supplier. The case was then handed over to the New York City Police Department, where it was assigned to Manhattan's Chief of Detectives, Inspector Joseph Farrow. Determined to uncover the truth, Inspector Farrow immediately visited the furniture store owned by George Sachs on 8th Avenue. Initially, Mr. Sachs struggled to recall any specific details about the customer who had purchased the pillowcase. However, Farrow's persistence paid off. After a thorough search of the store's receipts, the inspector found an important lead. On August 26, 1913, a customer named A. Van Dyke had purchased a mattress, bed springs, pillows, and pillowcases. The order had been delivered to a third-floor apartment at 68 Bradhurst Avenue in the Bronx. Acting swiftly, Inspector Farrow went directly to the building and spoke with the caretaker. The caretaker informed him that the apartment was occupied by a married couple, and that the husband was a man named Mr. H. Schmidt, a German who spoke with a thick accent. Unfortunately, the caretaker was unable to provide a description of the wife. Undeterred, the police set up a surveillance operation to monitor the apartment for 3 days, hoping to gather more information. However, no one appeared to come or go during that time, leaving investigators with no further leads. Despite the promising connection to the apartment and the purchase of the linens, the investigation seemed to stall. The police were left with few options, but the connection to Schmidt's apartment and the mysterious disappearance of Anna continued to weigh heavily on the case. While surveillance had not yet produced any results, it was clear that the links between the crime scene, the purchased linens, and the suspicious behavior at the apartment pointed towards a troubling possibility. Following the discovery of critical evidence in the apartment, Inspector Farrow immediately issued an order for Detective Frank Casassa to break into the unit and search for any further clues. The two officers entered, greeted by an unsettling silence. Though the room appeared to have been recently cleaned, a closer inspection revealed a much darker reality. Bloodstains, long dried, marred the walls, suggesting a violent confrontation had taken place. Among the various items in the kitchen, they found a large, blood-soaked knife resting on a shelf. The grisly discovery deepened their suspicions. Further searching uncovered more damning evidence. Articles of clothing were found with the name A. Van Dyke sewn into the lining. On the desk, several letters, some written in German, others in English, were addressed to someone named H. Schmidt. This growing pile of evidence began to form a clearer picture of what had happened. Could Anna, the woman whose dismembered remains were discovered in the river, have met her untimely end within this very apartment at 68 Bradhurst Avenue? As they sorted through the letters, one name appeared repeatedly: Anna Amula. The most recent address listed for her was 428 East 17th Street. Inspector Faru, along with detectives Casassa and O'Connell, made their way to this address, hoping for more information. Upon arrival, they learned that Anna had moved recently. She had left to begin work as a housekeeper at St. Boniface Church. The officers, undeterred, traveled to the church to follow this lead. They spoke to Father John Braun, who confirmed that Anna had indeed worked there. However, he revealed that she had been reassigned to St. Joseph's Church, where she started around the same time that Father H. Schmidt had been transferred. It was already very late, approximately 1:30 a.m., but Inspector Faru felt it was essential to pursue the investigation without delay. He knocked on the door of St. Joseph's Rectory and, after several attempts, was finally greeted by Father Daniel Quinn. Once Inspector Faru explained the situation, Father Quinn led the officers to Father Schmidt's room. Schmidt was asleep but quickly woke, looking confused as he rubbed his eyes. Realizing who stood before him, he remained eerily calm and simply said, "I killed her. I killed her because I loved her." In a cold, detached manner, Schmidt began to describe the details of the murder. He explained how he had murdered Anna and then dismembered her body. His recounting of the horrific act left both Father Quinn and the detectives shaken. What had once been a respected priest was now a man standing accused of one of the most gruesome crimes imaginable. With his confession in hand, Hans Schmidt was taken into police custody. The trial of Hans Schmidt began on December 8, 1913, in New York City. It was presided over by Judge Foster, and from the very beginning, it was clear that this case was extraordinary. The public was stunned by the idea that a priest, someone seen as a moral and spiritual leader, had committed such a brutal crime. The defense argued that Schmidt was not guilty by reason of insanity. They contended that his mental instability had rendered him incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions. To support this claim, the defense called witnesses who testified to Schmidt's erratic behavior. Some of them suggested that he had exhibited signs of a split personality and had grown increasingly detached from reality. Schmidt himself appeared to validate these assertions when he spoke in court. He told the jury that he had been compelled by voices to kill Anna. According to him, he had received a divine command to sacrifice her, believing it to be a holy directive from God. To strengthen the case for insanity, the defense brought in Dr. Smith Eli Jelliff, a psychologist who had examined Schmidt. Dr. Jelliff explained that Schmidt came from a long line of relatives who had displayed signs of mental instability. In total, the doctor noted that Schmidt had at least 60 relatives, both close and distant, who had suffered from various mental disorders. Based on this family history, as well as his own observations of Schmidt, Dr. Jelliff concluded that Schmidt was suffering from hereditary insanity. He argued that, due to this mental condition, Schmidt should be spared the death penalty. The prosecution, however, strongly opposed this defense. They argued that Schmidt's actions had been premeditated. The prosecution pointed to Schmidt's careful planning of the murder, as well as his calculated efforts to dispose of Anna's body. They emphasized that Schmidt had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks, suggesting that his actions were not those of a man who had lost his grip on reality, but rather those of someone who had intentionally carried out a brutal crime. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented evidence that Schmidt had carefully planned Anna's murder, further suggesting that his actions were deliberate. They pointed to his efforts to conceal the crime, such as his attempts to dismember the body and dispose of it. This, the prosecution argued, was evidence of his cold, calculated nature. Throughout the trial, Schmidt's defense team attempted to paint him as a man driven by mental illness, unable to fully comprehend his actions. Yet, the prosecution's evidence painted a very different picture, one of a man who had committed a horrific murder with a clear intention to hide his crime. The court was left to decide whether Schmidt's actions were truly the result of insanity or whether he had committed murder with full awareness and intent. The newspapers closely followed the trial, providing daily updates on Schmidt's behavior. Reporters noted that while the defendant sometimes appeared detached from his surroundings, He would at other moments make alarming remarks that painted a picture of a man struggling with profound psychological issues. This contrast only deepened the public's fascination with the case, making it a topic of intense speculation. After a lengthy trial and 36 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of deadlock on December 30th, 1913. Unable to reach a unanimous decision, the judge declared a hung jury, meaning that a second trial would be required. The judge's announcement only heightened the public's curiosity, prolonging the process and keeping the sensational case in the public eye. The retrial commenced on January 19, 1914, under the supervision of Justice Davis. This time, the prosecution introduced new testimony, including from a woman named Bertha Z., a former maid of Ernst Moret, Schmidt's alleged lover. Bertha revealed that in April of the previous year, Schmidt had asked her to impersonate Anna Amula so that he could secure a $5,000 life insurance policy on her, making himself the sole beneficiary. This revelation further illustrated Schmidt's premeditation in his plans for Anna's death. The defense once again called upon Dr. Smith Eli Jelliff, who reiterated his opinion that Schmidt was mentally unwell, further bolstering the defense's argument of insanity. Dr. Gregory, another expert, also testified to Schmidt's lack of sanity, supporting the theory that his actions were those of a man who was incapable of understanding the consequences of his crime. Additionally, Detective George Thompson revealed that Schmidt had been working on a plan to create a lethal poison for terminally ill individuals seeking to end their lives. Schmidt's twisted scheme involved providing these people with fraudulent death certificates so they could be buried without any public scandal. The detective suggested that Schmidt hoped to profit from this scheme, providing him with another source of income. Ernst Moret also took the stand, testifying about his relationship with Schmidt and their time together in the apartment at 68 Bradhurst Avenue. He confirmed that they had falsely told the landlord they were medical students conducting experiments. However, this claim was soon contradicted when police revealed that, in addition to the evidence of Anna's murder, they had discovered an illegal counterfeiting operation in the apartment. The kitchen had been set up as a darkroom, equipped with photographic materials and a printing press for producing counterfeit money. On February 5, 1914, after only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Hans Schmidt guilty of first-degree murder. Upon hearing his sentence of death, Schmidt reportedly looked at the judge and calmly declared, "I am satisfied with the verdict. I would rather die today than tomorrow." He was then transferred to Sing Sing prison to await his execution. Following the conviction, Schmidt's defense attorney filed an appeal, which delayed his execution as the case continued to move through the courts. In December 1914, Schmidt made a surprising statement, claiming that he had pretended to be insane during his trial. He now alleged that his former associate, Ernst Moret, had accidentally killed Anna during a botched abortion attempt. Schmidt insisted that he had not reported the death to authorities because he wished to protect Moret. However, these new allegations were quickly dismissed, especially after both Moret and Bertha Z. testified that Schmidt's version of events was untrue. Despite Schmidt's attempts to rewrite his story, his defense's efforts to secure a new trial were unsuccessful. On February 18, 1916, nearly 2 years after his conviction, Hans Schmidt was finally led to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. As he prepared to face his execution, he remained eerily composed. He was executed for the brutal and premeditated murder of Anna Amula, a crime that had shocked the public and highlighted the tragic and violent descent of a man once seen as a figure of spiritual authority. Strapped tightly into the chair, Father Hans Schmidt uttered his final words. He began with a solemn request, asking for forgiveness from all those he had offended or scandalized throughout his life. Then, in a calm and measured tone, he declared that he forgave all who had wronged him in turn. His last words were simple but poignant. "My final word is to say goodbye to my dear old mother." With those words, he took his place in history, and moments later, his execution was carried out. Following his death, Father Schmidt was buried in New York. However, the exact location of his grave remains a mystery to this day, as authorities chose not to disclose it. Speculation has long existed that Schmidt may have been involved in more crimes than just the one that led to his execution. Investigators suspected that his dark history stretched further, and they began to look into other cases that may have involved him. One of the most intriguing figures in Schmidt's life was a woman named Helen Green. Schmidt had been seen with her shortly before the murder of Anna Ommler, and shortly after Anna's death, Green vanished. She left for Chicago without a trace, and no one ever heard from her again. This disappearance raised further suspicions about Schmidt's potential involvement in other crimes. But the mystery deepened when authorities uncovered that another woman, whom Schmidt had referred to as his wife after her arrival in America, also disappeared without a word. Her disappearance, like that of Helen Green, seemed to be linked to Schmidt in some way, though no concrete evidence was ever found that would directly tie him to the crimes. As time went on, Schmidt's criminal activities became even more troubling. Investigators began to suspect that he had been involved in the deaths of 2 children. One of these children was a 5-year-old boy named August Van Dyke, who had been brought to Schmidt's apartment. Schmidt told anyone who inquired that the boy was his son. However, one day, the young child mysteriously vanished, and no one could explain what had happened to him. The strange disappearance of August raised even more questions about Schmidt's role in other unsolved cases. Despite these growing suspicions, Schmidt's criminal career appeared to be just beginning to unravel. After his conviction for Anna Ommler's murder, Schmidt became the focus of a wider investigation into other potential deaths. He was soon linked to the tragic and brutal killing of a 9-year-old girl named Alma Kellner, whose body was found dismembered and burned in the basement of St. John's Church in Louisville, Kentucky, where Schmidt had previously worked. Though the murder of Alma Kellner initially led to the conviction of Joseph Wendling, a church janitor, questions surrounding the case persisted. Wendling was sentenced to life in prison, but many still believed that Schmidt had been involved. In a surprising twist, Wendling was pardoned in 1935, and shortly after, he was deported back to his home country of France. This sudden reversal in the case stirred up even more speculation, as many felt that the real perpetrator, Schmidt, had never been fully brought to justice. The complexity of Schmidt's story and the tragic nature of his suspected crimes left an indelible mark on those who investigated him. The various disappearances, the deaths of children, and the brutal murder of Alma Kellner all pointed to a dark and twisted life filled with lies, deceit, and violence. Schmidt's death and the subsequent mystery of his final resting place only added to the many unanswered questions that lingered after his execution. In the years following his death, Schmidt's name continued to surface in discussions of criminal activity, and the extent of his involvement in other murders remained a subject of speculation. Yet, despite these suspicions, the truth of his actions and the full extent of his crimes may never be fully known. The unresolved nature of these cases, coupled with Schmidt's grim legacy, has left a haunting mark on the history of New York and beyond. The tragic end of Father Hans Schmidt raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the ability of someone so trusted in society to hide such dark secrets. His story serves as a chilling reminder of how carefully deception can be woven into the fabric of everyday life, leaving even the most seemingly righteous people capable of unimaginable horrors. Thank you for listening to this episode, and as always, we appreciate any comments or feedback you may have. I hope you'll join us again for the next case as we continue to explore the depths of history's darkest mysteries.